Thank you. Good evening, everybody. I want to thank you so much for your presence tonight. It really means a lot to me to see all of you in the audience. I promise to do my best to make this lecture informative, interesting, entertaining, and short. Tonight marks the end point of my doctoral study here at USC. And since the time I made that crazy decision to leave my job up in the beautiful Bay Area and moved to Los Angeles to do this DMA, I had entered a period of deep contemplation on why I wanted to put myself through 4 more years of grueling study. In hindsight, yes, it was grueling, but in so many other ways, so incredibly rewarding. I certainly wanted to continue my study of collaborative piano, but one thing that attracted me to USC in particular was the academic minor and the elective fields. I knew that one of the things that I wanted to do was to study Filipino music in depth and to try to satisfy my curiosity of it through the academic minor. As a young child growing up in Canada, I heard Filipino music often. Whenever we would have celebrations or parties, at some point in the night, my tita Cora would be summoned to the piano and the music would begin. Taking whatever instruments we had lying around, my parents and relatives would sing old Filipino songs, sometimes in Tagalog, Bisaya, and in other Filipino languages. I would observe this with a mixture of fascination, delight, and dread, as sometimes it meant that I'd have to be pried from the underwater world of 2-2 of my Super Mario Brothers Nintendo game to play these pieces with them. Sometimes us kids would go to bed long before my relatives and tell them to stop singing. They would sing late into the night and we would have to go downstairs to reprimand them to be quiet because we were sleeping. As a young piano student studying Bach, Clementi, Beethoven, and Chopin, it got me thinking about Filipino music. And I always wondered if there was a tradition of Filipino music. There were numerous copies of Filipino songs that we had 3rd or 4th generation photocopies of, but in every library that I looked at the time, I always came up short. However, as I continued my quest for this music in libraries of larger universities, I eventually discovered a rich body of music with a fascinating and interesting history. And the study of this music has not only enhanced my repertoire list in a wonderful way, but more importantly, provided me with deeper insights on how music acts as a powerful force in shaping beliefs and identities. As a colony of Spain for over 300 years, the Philippines is considered to be a unique nation in Southeast Asia because of its long connection with Western culture. Though Filipinos kept their native languages, cultural remnants from Spain deeply influenced and continue to remain part of Filipino culture. Perhaps one of the most striking features of the continuing Spanish colonial past is through religion. Because of the success of the missionary activities of the Spanish friars, the population continues to be more than 80% Catholic. The Spanish made use of religion to help facilitate the transition to colonial administration, and one of the most important vehicles that they used in this effort was music. Let me interrupt and say, however, that a local concept of classical music forms of expression of high aesthetic value did exist in the Philippine archipelago before the Spanish conquest. Forms of developed music were in practice and continue to evolve in Philippine societies that were able to stay outside of the sphere of influence of Europe and of the United States. However, as the Spanish bureaucrats kept written records documenting their early observations of Filipino life, it is easier for us to discern information about the musical life of the colonial period, albeit through the eyes of the Spanish bureaucrats. In his new book called Colonial Counterpoint, David Irving discusses the process in which the Spanish friars made use of music to facilitate the passage of Catholic scripture to the indigenous population. Musical transculturation was inseparable from religious conversion and social transformation in the context of colonial rule. The awit, or song, was passed down through oral transmission and became one of the most principal and effective vehicles through which Christian doctrine could be disseminated through the Spanish period. The intersection of indigenous and Spanish idioms found reciprocal expression in the awit, both textually and musically. Tagalog lyrics were replaced with religious verses, and European musical idioms found their way into the genre. This slide is a record of a plain chant that was found in the archives of the Provincia Dominicana de Nuestra Señora del Rosario in Avila, Spain. Here we can see a plain chant melody transcribed with Tagalog verses. It was common in the time for missionary sermons or the Christian doctrine to be sung to traditional indigenous melodies and vice versa. These forms of musical mixture or syncretism within the awit are a clear example of musical and cultural convergences in colonial praxis, and eventually became a principal feature of Filipino song and other musical expressions, a characteristic that prevails today in all types of music. It is this musical habitus that ushered in the age of Filipino Classicism. The time period of music as an art form in the Philippines spanned from the 19th century, coming into full bloom at the advent of the 20th century. As I mentioned before, Filipinos had been trained for centuries in the craft of music making according to European norms, mainly in the Catholic cathedrals. However, in the 1800s, the Philippines experienced the introduction and spread of major art forms outside of the sacred realm. The introduction of the zarzuela in 1848 from Spain and opera in the 1860s marked a new era. During this time, such theaters as the Teatro Sorolla and the Manila Grand Opera House housed such zarzuela groups as the Compañía Zarzuela Cómica Lírica, while musical organizations such as orchestras, chamber ensembles, and chamber ensembles became a part of the musical life of the local bourgeoisie. The political climate during this stage of Filipino classical music is particularly interesting and deeply influenced the course and purpose of music composed during this time. The two major political events of the time period, the Spanish-American War and the subsequent American colonial period, had a major impact on music, not only influencing the compositional style and the language, but also using music for social and political aims. A fascinating thesis by Carmen Flores on Filipino themes and resistance elements in the zarzuela described how the Filipinos used the zarzuela, a genre brought by Spain, as a channel to voice their sentiments of political resistance. Through the use of indigenous melodies and dance forms, the metaphorical poetry in the songs of the zarzuela, and the use of the various symbols throughout the play, the zarzuela was able to unify and send a message to a populist audience. With the transference of power from the Spanish to the Americans after the Treaty of Paris of 1898, the sense of liberation was short-lived. The resistance struggles remained, and the use of music took on a different role as Americans incorporated the use of music for nation building and the creation of a common Filipino identity. The kundiman, or Filipino song, became particularly instrumental to this end. The kundiman is a song form that evolved from the pre-colonial awit, a generic term for song that is still in use today. Like the awit, the Filipino kundiman inherited a similar porous tendency, absorbing many foreign influences. The kundiman appeared around the 19th century and is a song genre that deals exclusively with love and all of its manifestations: romantic, paternal, patriotic, and filial. The kundiman first appeared as a simple harmonized folk song that existed in oral tradition and evolved to a developed song form that absorbed characteristics from the Western musical styles. It grew to be a powerful cultural weapon that became a tool for revolutionary expression, as well as a vehicle for espousing the ideological goals of nationalism during the American period. The classical kundiman as we know it today has distinctive musical characteristics and form. It is usually in triple meter with the piano introduction in binary form, the A section in minor key and the B section in major key. Like the German Lied, the kundiman were composed with close collaboration between poet and composer. Filipino poets like José Rizal, Deo Gracias del Rosario, and José Corazón de Jesús penned romantic kundiman texts in Tagalog, Spanish, and other Filipino languages. Through their texts, recurrent themes of melancholy, unrequited love, and unfailing loyalty seemed to reveal a consistent preoccupation. The veiled expressions in the poetry, however, signified much more than the surface meaning. Under colonial rule, it was dangerous for Filipinos to express what was subversive, and the use of metaphor to express concealed sentiments reflects the indirect and discreet Filipino social code of cultural communication that only they understood. Poetic themes of longing and profound unrequited love served as larger expressions for the yearning of national independence, a theme that has remained constant for Filipinos for centuries. A closer look at kundiman poetry, such as in Bayan Ko, Sa Ugoy ng Duyan, and Mutya ng Pasig, for example, reveal texts that can be read on a number of these levels. During revolutionary periods, the kundiman became a vehicle of expressive political sentiment and criticism. Perhaps the best-known kundiman is Constancio de Guzman's Bayan Ko, which became the unofficial patriotic anthem and was sung during the people power movements of the past century. The kundiman became an ideological tool during the era of nation building that resulted from the new American regime's insistence that Filipino artists need to develop a sense of nationalism that promoted pride for what was distinctly Filipino in the native way of life. In the overall educational scheme of the American colonial administration, the curricula were designed so as to heighten esteem and regard for knowledge and to be completely assimilated into a concept of civilization according to European notions of social behavior, intellectual growth, and cultural development, as well as the American ideals of democracy and progress. In redirecting and refocusing the nationalist aspirations of the local intellectuals, the academic programs in music established by the Americans sought to raise the creative skills of Filipino composers to the same level of composers from the Western world, and to create and produce a distinctly Filipino classical music literature. For this reason, Filipino music students were taught to follow the examples of the nationalist movements in the arts of music of other westernized peoples outside of Western Europe, like Russia, Hungary, Finland, and Mexico. This technique of using music as a nationalizing tool in the aftermath of social and political revolution found its precedent in 19th century Germany. In a similar manner, the growth of German nationalism was manifested through the cultivation of this idea through literature, arts, and music. Perhaps the most striking feature of nationalism in music, and in art song specifically, is the utilization of folk tales and melodies as its textual and musical substance. The adaptation of folk for art song can be traced to 18th century Enlightenment writer Johann Gottfried Herder, whose treatise on the origins of language and thought reinforced the Rousseauian idealization of the primitive, the noble savage, as the bearer of essential truth. The thrust of Herder's argument maintained that each culture expresses its worldview through language, and that it is in language that one reveals essential truth of cognitive, ontological, and articulated aspects of a particular culture. From there, we reach the essence of our own common identities. To this end, Herder compiled volumes of folk melodies from across Europe and Scandinavia. The rise of nationalism during this Enlightenment period occurred due to a number of factors, including the advent of print capitalism, which enabled rapid distribution of thought and ideas across a much wider readership, the dissolution of the link between cosmology and history and the advent of secular thought, and the advancement of scientific and technological breakthroughs. With the dissolution of religious and feudal absolutism, a new way of linking fraternity, time, and community was needed. Thus, nationalism was born, and people linked to one another through a shared historical experience. Thus, the employment of folk material in music to further nationalistic identity is a technique that stemmed from Herder's Enlightenment era and continues to be used both in Western and non-Western societies. Folk becomes cultural capital. The more pure and the more unfettered, the better. The output from this period resulted in much artistic production during the Romantic era. Franz Schubert derived numerous texts of his prodigious output of lieder from Herder's compendium. Among these are the famous Erlkönig and Heidenröslein. Brahms' Zigeunerlieder is a cycle of gypsy folk tunes and subject matter. German nationalistic fervor was paralleled in literature and other arts of the time of the March Revolution of 1848. It is during this period that Grimm fairy tales canonized what were supposed German virtues and ideals. Das Knabenwunderhorn by Brentano and Arnim formed the text of an important Mahler song cycle. Massive German choral works such as the Brahms Triumphlied, Opus 55, and the rise of numerous men's choruses helped to sacralize German nationalism in music. The rise of such works helped to propel and perpetuate the supremacy of German music and culture, unfortunately leading to the distorted political climate which influenced Wagner, the Nazi regime, and gave rise to World War II. Other political regimes have made use of a similar tactic, including the use of state music during the Soviet period of the early and mid-20th century. Matthew Gelbart, in his book, The Invention of Folk in Art Music, describes the phenomenon of elevating folk music to art status and solidifying a common nationalist identity, and describes the essentializing of cultural traits as problematic. The issue that arises in the Filipino case deals with the process of hybridizing two musical traditions to create a national sense, and whether this is something authentic and that resonates with the people. More importantly, the urging of the Americans to study Western forms could be seen as displaying an inherent Western superiority and prevailing colonial attitude towards Filipino culture. By stressing the importance of learning the techniques of music composition at the highest level, as well as defining a distinctive national character in their works, the American educators were able to obfuscate the idea of using music as an instrument of sedition and rebellion. Indeed, the question of agenda, representation, and authenticity in the homogenizing of Filipino identity is raised when analyzing this conception of this body of nationalist music. The rise of Filipino national music occurred in two stages. One, during the Spanish-American War period, where Filipinos were using protest songs derived from popular folk melodies to conceal their sentiments of dissension, and more remarkably during the American colonial period, when they were urged on by American administrators to come up with a music that was distinctly Filipino, that reflected the spirit, attitude, and essence of the people. Of course, this is problematic since the reality of the Philippines encompasses an archipelago of over 7,100 islands, where more than 100 languages and ethnic tribes reside. To further this effort, Filipino composers Francisco Santiago, Lucio San Pedro, Antonio Molina, Nicanor Abelardo, and Rodolfo Cornejo were sent to study Western models of composition in order to import them back home and to create the new Filipino sound, to invent a new tradition. These composers studied at such schools as Juilliard and the Chicago School of Music, and together their contributions formed the invention of the new Filipino classical tradition. During this period, the kundiman transformed from a harmonized folk song to a formal genre, and the composers strove to musically express Filipino essence. Using Western compositional techniques, they expanded the binary form of the kundiman to a three-part form, with a set harmonic structure, and experimented with more chromatically complex harmonies, thus transforming folk elements into a more Western art song form. Eventually, Filipinos embraced the mix as their own. The way in which folk melodies were infused in the kundiman is something that I find to be particularly interesting, And Ramon Santos provides an excellent discussion on this topic in his 4 essays on Filipino music. Rather than provide harmonic accompaniments to folk tunes, Filipino composers took small quotations of folk songs in the kundiman and developed a musical idea. Santos identifies 3 possible tune fragments. The first from the revolutionary kundiman Joselinong Baliwag, the second from the kundiman of 1800, which can be found in Francisco Santiago's Anak ng Dalita, and from the kundiman of 1870, which was adopted as a musical setting for Jose Rizal's Paalam sa Pakadalaga. The first formally written kundiman all use melodic quotations from these models, evolving in the process a formal framework of the kundiman as an artistic composition. The first tune variety that I mentioned, Joselinong Baliwag, was a kundiman of the insurrection during the 1896 revolution in Bulacan, and was found in the collection of the library of the Orquesta Molina de Don Juan Molina. It was a patriotic song in the guise of a song of love and courtship, with musical cryptography of the name Pepita, the beloved figure of the poetry. Here's a cover photo of the printed music, and the tune of the melody goes like this. This musical motive serves as the seed for many other later compositions of kundiman. One striking example that I thought, it's melodic also and rhythmic. This is the kundiman by Bonifacio Abdon, one of the first kundimans ever written. Another example of this is found in the final strain of Constancio de Guzman's Bayan Ko, where we find a parallel musical motive with Francisco Santiago's Pakiusap, which we will be performing tonight. So this is the last phrase of Bayan Ko. The influence of Spanish and American musical language can also be clearly heard in the harmonization of these kundimans. Kathleen and I will show you a little interlude from one of the songs that we're performing tonight, Magbalik Ka Hirang, that shows both Spanish and American influences. We'll just play a short little excerpt from it. You'll hear the rest of it later. Another piece that we're performing tonight is the Cornejo Violin Sonata, which you'll see has a heavy German post-romantic chromatic language. You'll hear it later in the second half. Many expressions of Filipino nationalism, from music to art to literature, incorporate ideas and aesthetics that at one time were considered foreign but became localized through repeated use and adaptation. And the inevitable change of music as it becomes part of native expression relates to the natural internalization of aesthetics as much as it does to the spell of hegemony. The result culminated in a song form that became further hybridized with Western musical elements, and the profusion of works during this time made it the golden era of the kundiman. Some of the most renowned Filipino classical singers introduced the world to Filipino art song. These forgotten names were legends of their time, not only in the Philippines, but also on the world stage. Aurelio Estanislao, the most esteemed singer of Kundiman, was the first Filipino to win the Premier Prix de Chant from the Conservatoire National de Musique de Paris. Estancio studied at the Sorbonne and the Mozarteum in Salzburg, and he studied with Pierre Bernac and Lotte Lehmann. His live album of Kundiman, Ala Ala, remains one of the premier recordings of this genre. Jovita Fuentes, celebrated Filipino opera and art song singer of the early 20th century, performed such roles as Mimi, Chocho-san, and Salome in opera houses all around North America and Europe. Meanwhile, in the realm of instrumental music, performing musicians from Europe and America alike visited the archipelago, such as Yehudi Menuhin, André Segovia, Pierre Fournier, Jascha Heifetz, introducing classical music performances to the Filipino public. Teachers from abroad also set the foundation for classical music education in the Philippines. Hungarian pianist-composer Jenő Takács was the first director of the UP Conservatory of Music at Diliman, and Italian composer-conductor Alexander Lipay headed the Philippine Academy of Music. This cross-pollination of musics gave rise to a body of Filipino chamber compositions from such composers as Lucrecia Casilag, Antonio Molino, and Rodolfo Cornejo. I'd like to return to the original question that sparked this research. Why is this music important to us today? Originally, my research into this genre came out of a curiosity for music that could enhance the Western canon of classical music that I have studied for years. What I gained from the study, however, is much more than that. For one, the study of the Kundiman shed important light on the Western canon of repertoire that I've studied all my life, and all of the aesthetic assumptions that we have about music. I realized just how powerfully political agendas play in the creation of nationalist identities. And this realization has sparked a curiosity within me to look deeper into the origins of some of our aesthetic attitudes. When I was researching Filipino repertoire, I sometimes came up short in my first forays into the pieces, finding only simple harmonizations or doubled melodies of folk tunes. Compared to the highly complex and harmonically sophisticated sonatas that I had studied all of my life, I felt a kind of sense of defeat in that perhaps our music was just not as developed as Western music. I encountered numerous difficulties finding music, even in the Philippines, at the university libraries and at the Cultural Center of the Philippines, much less to find information about it. Through this, however, I came to a realization that this was a reflection of a fundamental difference between cultures that I found to be beautiful. That this was actually a reflection of a core value in Filipino culture, that knowledge, passed through oral transmission, evolves and changes naturally, rather than remaining canonized and memorialized in a book. This realization helped to expand my worldview and reframe my thinking. Getting back to that encroaching sense of defeat, I realized that I had lost the point of all of this. The point was not to find a Filipino music that was on par with, say, Bach, Beethoven, or Brahms. Our cultural history contains a wildly different narrative than any Western European one. Yet, with all of the confusing mix of cultures through our colonial past, Filipinos have managed to take foreign forms and not only make them their own, but also make them an instrument of resistance. This is an aspect of our culture of which we can find a million examples and testifies to our creativity and resilience. In a similar way, this Filipino music can serve as an interesting lesson for Filipinos in a larger sense, that the differences in our culture must be fairly addressed, and that colonial mentality of constantly comparing oneself to Western values and standards, as we have been taught to do for years, must be examined. I believe that it has never been more critical than in this age that we recognize the power of music and arts in this respect, that we recognize the necessity of promoting a sense of strong cultural identity in a country that has suffered greatly from a weakened sense of pride, not only to increase a national consciousness, but also to foster growth and development. In the words of Felipe de Leon, the National Commissioner for Culture and the Arts of the Philippines. Cultural identity is a fundamental source of social empowerment, and consequently, cultural identity and pride are imperative to socioeconomic growth. The importance of cultural identity extends further than the physical border of the Philippines and becomes even more relevant to the imagined community of millions of displaced Filipinos in the diaspora. In conclusion, the Kundiman played an integral role at the forefront of every popular Filipino revolution of the last century, and showed how a genre that was created under nationalist guise became so powerful and simultaneously rejected the legitimacy of the state. It is in this time that the Kundiman can again take on a revolutionary function to serve as a symbol of our cultural identity and a testament to the Filipino experience. Its seemingly simple facade intimately encapsulates subtle aspects of Filipino culture that are relived with each performance. While the poetry of the Kundiman expresses common inner experiences, the container of musical language and form provide a glimpse of our historical narrative. The double entendre of the poetry expresses the discrete Filipino manner of communication. The harana intimately recalls the all but forgotten courting ritual of serenade. The sense of struggle in the pieces testifies to the frustration felt by our forefathers and perhaps even today. Each song articulates a clearer memory of a shared history and tells us about ourselves, our struggle, our history, our unique way of communicating love for one another in a way that every Filipino knows intimately, in music and in song. Thank you.
So the first two songs I will be singing tonight is Mutya ng Pasig and Bahay Tuburon. And the first piece is about the Lady of the Pasig River. It begins with me narrating about how the night is waking up the princess. And it goes into her waking up, and I present her words to you, saying that I was once a princess of love, and one day my kingdom died, I died with it. But one day, if you want me to return to you, return my kingdom to me. And the second piece, Hay Tuburon, is about leaving my home and being instructed to one day return home. And it starts off with me singing to a spring about my regrets of leaving home and one day returning to my family and everything that I left behind.
Kung kami nung So Irene and I will be performing Magbalik Kahirang. It's a song about a love, a sweet, sweet love that I have lost. And I try so hard through my memories to capture that and to hold it once again, but it always disappears. On the second half of the song, I plead saying, please come back to me, please come back to me. If you come back, I will put your heart and your love on a pedestal.
The song I'll be singing, Sa Ugoy ng Duyan, can be understood as a metaphor for two kinds of mothers. There is the mother that is the mother you are born to, and also the mother that is your homeland. So it's from these two lenses that the song speaks. In the first verse, the song speaks about wishing for a time long past that was beautiful and serene, and longing to be cradled in the arms of the mother. The second verse talks about being under the stars and being taken care of the stars, as if the stars were the one who is caring and nurturing for you, like the stars in the homeland before we were conquered and ruled by foreigners. As the song can be understood as also as longing to be and hearing the songs of the mother again, we would like to dedicate this song to our own nanay, to our mother, who's in the audience tonight. Also, on the occasion of us both finishing our doctoral degrees, I tell you a funny little story. When my mother was growing up in Mantikau, which is in the Mindanao, the large southern island, she wanted to play the piano so much, but of course we came from very poor families, and so the only way that my mother could practice, or try to practice, was to create a cardboard cutout and draw the piano keys and try and practice that way. So even though my mother, of course, could never become a pianist, and though she wanted for us to be doctors of medicine, or lawyers, or scientists, or et cetera, we believe that our mother's dream to be an artist came out in her children. And so we present this to you today as a dream, a completion of our dream, but also of our mothers.
Nais ko'y maulit ang awit ni Inang mahal. Awit ang pag-ibig habang ako'y nasa duyan. Ang munti pang bata sa piling nanay, nais ko'y maulit ang awit ni Inang mahal. Awit ang pag-ibig habang ako'y nasa Bantay ko'y tala, ang tanod ko'y bituin. Sa piling ni nanay, langit ang buhay. Puso kong may dosay, sabik sa ugoy ng duyan. Sana'y di nagmaliw bata sa piling nanay. Nais ko'y maulit ang awit ni inang mahal. Awit ang pag-ibig habang ako'y nasa duyan. Sa aking pagtulog nalabis ang himbing. Ang bantay ko'y tala, ang damot ko'y bituin. Sa piling ni nanay, langit ang buhay. Puso kong may dusay, sabik sa ugoy ng duyan. Ibig kong matulog sa dating duyan ko, ina. Oh, ina.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. The two songs that I'll be singing is a typical Harana music. The first one is Pakiusap. It means it's pleading for the love of a man to a woman. And the second one, Madaling Araw, is about early dawn. And the man is waiting for early dawn because there is hope that one day the lady would fall in love to him.